Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. My name is James Carroll. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, you're welcome here. Today is the 13th of our series on biblical scholarship and literacy. We're going to talk about Joseph in Egypt, and we'll tell the rest of that particular story. I want to remind everyone that we have a webpage. I try to keep it up to date. Sometimes it's behind. But this webpage has links to the lectures. If you want to go back and see the others, I record them all, and the links to those recordings are there. It has the readings for that day and some additional readings, useful things you might find, commentaries, that sort of stuff. Sites.google.com/view biblical scholarship and literacy. Today what we're going to do is we're going to review last class where we talked about initiation and the story of Joseph, Judah, and Tamar. Then we're going to talk about Joseph in prison, Joseph's ascension in Egypt, and then finally we'll talk about his back and forth with his brothers and reconciliation. So if we remember what we did last time, we talked about initiation, and we used that to help us make a little more sense of the story of the wrestle with the angel. We talked about things like exile, ordeals, secret names, new names, reconciliation, reintegration, marks for remembrance, etc. And we said that probably has something to tell us about what's really happening in that story that's otherwise really confusing. And then we talked about Jacob's family. And you notice that Jacob has several wives. His favorite wife, the one he wanted to marry, remember he was tricked into marrying her sister, but the one he wanted to marry was Rachel. She only has 2 children, Joseph and then later Benjamin. And so there's some favoritism that goes on in his family tree. There was a story interwedged right in the middle of Joseph's story, and it was this really strange story of Judah and Tamar. Right, where Judah has a daughter-in-law who marries his son and he dies, and then he marries her second son and he dies, and he decides she's bad luck. But you remember, it's his job to give her his third youngest son as a husband, and he refuses to do that, so she dresses up like a harlot, and he sleeps with her, and she gets pregnant from him, and that provides for her and her. We talked about the strangeness of that story, but we also talked about the cultural context that makes it make some sense. And you remember she takes from him his signet, his staff, and he says she'll use these to identify him later and prove that he's the father of her child. So this will become important in the Joseph story in a minute, which is why we're going to bring it up. Joseph is favored by his father because he's the child of his favored wife in his old age, and he gives him a coat. We said many colors is probably a mistranslation, but we don't actually know quite what it should be. Coat of patched work coat or coat of embroidered coat, something like this. But it's a sign of his favoritism, and his brothers don't like it. He also has this dream that he then reports to his brothers, you remember? Of all the stars and the sun and the moon bowing to him and the sheaves of corn bowing to him. And he says, this means, you're all going to bow to me. And his brothers don't particularly appreciate this, obviously. And then he starts bringing bad reports to his dad about how his brothers are goofing off instead of taking care of the flocks. And his brothers decide to take care of him. So they catch him and they throw him in a pit. And then the story becomes muddled because there's multiple sources that each claim something different happens here. Reuben tries to save him. Judah suggests they sell him, and then they go back to the pit, and Ishmaelites have taken him and sold him in one version. And in another version, the brothers sell him. So in one version, they find him gone on their way to sell him, and on the other version, they actually do sell him. It just depends on the version of the story, and both of those versions are in the text, and it's muddled. And then he ends up a prison in Egypt, and he rises to be the head of his owner, his master, Potiphar's house, where he is then accosted by Potiphar's wife, who wants him to sleep with her. And we talked about whether the possibility that Potiphar was a eunuch, and possible some explanation of why she's interested in this. And he refuses, and he runs away, and she grabs his coat and then has his coat as a prop, and she accuses him of rape. And the husband comes home, and instead of killing Joseph, he throws Joseph in prison, which we said was a little bit interesting. You would expect the husband to execute Joseph, a slave who did this. And so the possibility here is that the husband isn't sure he believes his wife even. Maybe she's done this sort of thing before and isn't trustworthy. So Joseph ends up in prison, and this is where we left Joseph. The story is one of descent. And the text actually uses the word he went down or was taken down. Down comes up over and over again. Down into a pit. Down into Egypt. Egypt is down vertically. You descend vertically on your way to Egypt. But it's also metaphorically down. It's south. But whenever you talk about Israel, you go up to Israel and you go down to Egypt. So he goes down into Egypt and then down into a prison. And in fact, this whole story is interwoven with dreams. And there is an Egyptian book of interpreting dreams, several actually. The Egyptians were very interested in dreams and dream interpretations. Very much like Freud, they had almost a list of things. If you dream this, it means this. If you dream this, it means this. And there was a list of how to interpret dreams, very methodical. And one of those says, if you dream that you're thrown into a pit, it means you'll be sent to prison. And of course, Joseph was thrown into a pit and then sent to prison. So there's some Egyptian ties to this story that are very authentic and old. It has been suggested that these Egyptian ties, and I'll bring them up as they come, are evidence that the story is historical. I would point out that what it really is evidence of is that the author knows Egypt. He knows the culture and time of Egypt. That doesn't mean it really happened. It just means there are authentic Egyptian elements in the text. The historicity is very hard to say one way or another. So when we left it last time, the real question is, how is this going to work out? Joseph had a dream, and if we assume the dream is prophetic, his brothers are going to bow to him, and his father and mother, the sun and moon. How is this going to happen? Well, Joseph is nowhere near his parents, nowhere near his brothers. He's in a different nation from them. He's a slave. He's in prison. No one's bowing to him in prison. And what's going to happen? So let's pick up the story here. And if we look at Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 19, it says, "It came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, After this manner the servants did to me, and his wrath was kindled. He took Joseph from his master's house and put him into prison." Right? And then that gets us where we're at, right? And then what happens? Well, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, verse 21, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. That's exactly what happened in Potiphar, right? He became a slave, and God showed him mercy, and everything he did prospered, so his master put him in charge of his house. Well, here it says, "And the keeper of the prison committed into Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were with him, and whatsoever they did there, and he was the doer of it." So Joseph becomes, if you send him to prison, he becomes in charge of the prison. If you send him to Potiphar's house as a slave, he becomes in charge of Potiphar's house. This is what happens wherever you send Joseph. Even if you send him to prison, he prospers there. And he's there many years. And then it says that, you remember this prison is the prison that the Pharaoh sends his prisoners to. And the Pharaoh sends two individuals, this is chapter 40, which we'll just summarize, a baker and a butler. I always want to say the baker and the butcher, and that's not right. It's the baker and the butler. And so he sends the baker and the butler to prison. These are the Pharaoh's prisoners, and these are the Pharaoh's baker and the Pharaoh's butler. And while they're in prison, these people have two dreams. Now, again, if you look at these Egyptian book of dream interpretations, they say if dreams are especially repeated, or if there's two of them, that makes them evidence that they're more significant than random things you just dream and forget. So these two people have a dream, and they dream them on the same night, and the dreams are similar. And so that would be evidence to an Egyptian that the dreams are prophetic. That's what the Egyptian would believe. And they come to Joseph, and they say, "What do these dreams mean?" And they tell him their dreams. And the butler dreams that he was a cupbearer of the Pharaoh, so he dreams of 3 branches of grapes that grow out, and then he presses the grapes into the cup, and he hands the cup to Pharaoh. And the butler dreams of 3 baskets of bread, 3 baskets of bread on his head, and he brings them like he's going to bring them to Pharaoh, except they're eaten by birds. And they say, what do these dreams mean? And Joseph says, well, I've got some good news and I got some bad news. The good news is, Butler, you're going to be in 3 days restored to your position, and you will again put the cup in the Pharaoh's hand. That's what your dream means. And you can imagine the baker thinking, this is great, what does my dream mean? And Joseph says, well, your dream means that in 3 days the Pharaoh is going to execute you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh. And the butler is not too happy with that answer, and probably hopes that it's not going to come true. Well, Joseph tells the butler, when you are back in the Pharaoh's court, please remember me. I've been wrongly accused. I don't belong here. Help me get out of prison. Well, 3 days go by, and the dream comes true. The baker is executed, the butler is returned to his station, and again serves the Pharaoh, and he's so excited to get out that he forgets all about Joseph and never mentions him to anyone. And Joseph stays in prison several more years. That's Genesis chapter 40. Which brings us to 41, where the Pharaoh has a dream. And he has this dream, again, the doubling, on 2 nights. So the dream is repeated. The first night he dreams of 7 fat cows that come up out of the Nile. And then following those are 7 lean cows that come up out of the Nile, and the lean cows eat the fat cows. And he wakes up. So the next night he dreams, and this time he sees 7 ears of fat corn, and then he sees 7 blasted corn that come up after them. And then the fat corn eat the fat grain kernels, eat the blasted ones. Obviously, sorry, this is not corn. Corn is a New World crop, but it's a reference to grain. Okay, so what does this dream mean? Well, he, of course, does what any good Pharaoh would do. It says, let's see if I can find the right verse. Verse 8 of chapter 41. It came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Why couldn't they just make up an interpretation? Well, again, the author knows his Egyptian context. There are these books of interpretation. They would have had to look through the books for what is the symbol of the cow, what's the symbol of and they tried to use those books to find an interpretation, and they weren't coherent when they did. And so they couldn't find an interpretation from their books that made the 2 dreams make sense and work together. You could easily interpret the cows according to the dream. There is a meaning for cows in the dream, and there's a meaning for eating, and you could put that together and make up an interpretation. But then the second dream had different symbols, and when you put them together, they didn't work. Well, you remember Joseph says, there's a place in the text where Joseph says the interpretation of dreams is God's. It's not from these books and looking it up. You're supposed to get your interpretations by inspiration from God, which is presumably what Joseph claims he can do. You remember, Joseph is a dreamer. He had the dreams of his brothers bowing to him. He interpreted the dreams of the people in Pharaoh's court, the baker and the butler. And now he would be able to interpret this dream, presumably. And the butler remembers Joseph all of a sudden. In the middle of all this worry, he's like, oh yeah, there was this guy in prison who interpreted my dream. I bet he could interpret your dream. And Pharaoh's like, well, bring him. So Joseph gets up out of prison in verse 14. Pharaoh called for Joseph, and they brought him hastily up out of the dungeon. Now he's going up. Right, so all this other, he was coming down, and now he's going up. So we're on the other side of this story. Now he's ascending. They brought him up out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. He shaved himself. We know from Egyptian drawings that Egyptians were clean-shaven. They didn't have beards, and we also know that the Israelites had beards. In fact, whenever the Egyptians show someone from northern Mesopotamian region, they show them with beards. So we have Egyptian paintings of these bearded men, and that's how you know they're a foreigner, and these shaved Egyptians. So Joseph is a very Egyptian person. He's presented as an Egyptian. He shaves like an Egyptian. He speaks Egyptian. He walks and talks like an Egyptian. And so again, he's shaving. Again, this is an authentic part of the story. Okay, so he comes up to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, what do my dreams mean? And I think most of us know this story and know what the dreams mean, but let's go through them. Joseph says, the 7 fat cows are 7 good years. And the 7 lean cows are 7 lean years. And the same with the 7, ears of corn and the 7 blasted ears of grain. Those are fat years and lean years. And he says, and the God gave you the dream twice so that you would know that it is from God, and God is telling you what he's going to do. There will be 7 good years, and those 7 good years will be followed by 7 years of famine. So what I think you should do is find a wise man and put him in charge of gathering all the extra food during the 7 good years, and you can store that up in a grain house, and then you can eat that grain during the lean years, and thus will your kingdom prosper. And Pharaoh says, I don't know any wise men who could be in charge of that, but here you are, able to interpret my dream. And for whatever reason, Pharaoh believes his interpretation, probably because it's a story and that's literary advice. They don't have to go into why. But Pharaoh thinks this is a good interpretation. He says, we need a wise man. How about you, Joseph? And so Joseph goes from being a slave in Egypt to being presented to the Pharaoh, speaking to Pharaoh, interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and then being put in charge of this grain project that he recommends as a solution to Pharaoh's dream. Of course, if the dream doesn't come true, you can imagine that Joseph would probably at this point be executed or something, right? But Joseph is now a very important man in Egypt. And it says in verse 40 of chapter 41, thou shalt be over my house, and according to all thy word shall all my people be ruled. This is exactly what happened. You send Joseph to Potiphar's house as a slave, he becomes in charge of Potiphar's house. You send Joseph to prison, he ends up in charge of the prison. You send him to Pharaoh's court, he ends up in charge of Pharaoh's court. Right? Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. 42. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vesture of fine linen and put a gold chain on his neck. This is what I would call intertextuality. Now, I know we did this last time, but if you cast your mind back to the Judah story, the Judah story was an interlude, right? We, if you remember the order, we sell Joseph into Egypt, we have this Judah and Tamar story, and then we pick up Joseph in Potiphar's house. It builds tension. It's put right in the middle in order to build tension. But it also has intertextuality with the rest of the story. For example, Judah's immoral behavior with regard to sexuality is contrasted with Joseph's refusal to sleep with Potiphar's wife. Those stories are contrasted. Joseph's father is convinced that Joseph is dead by they bring his coat dipped in blood, remember, to him, and that's how they convince him. So there's a coat as well. Well, when Joseph is then confronted by Potiphar's wife, she uses a coat to falsely accuse him of the evidence that he had tried to assault her. Now when Joseph is ascended in Egypt, the Pharaoh gives him a ring. And they actually call him, he'll become kind of the viceroy of Egypt. This is a position we actually know in Egypt. And the Egyptian term for this position is the seal bearer. The king's seal bearer is the one who has and does the things that Joseph does in this story. The ring is almost certainly a signet ring. We have lots of these signet rings from Egypt. And so there is a cord and a ring, a seal. Well, you remember in the Judah story? Judah gives to Tamar his seal on a cord around his neck that he wore on a cord. His wasn't a ring, but he gave her his signet seal that he wore on a cord around his neck. And Joseph is given a cord that goes around his neck of gold and the king's signet seal. And this is each story calling back to the other. It's what Judah was used and what Tamar used to accuse Judah in the story and to clear herself. And then these become the tokens whereby Joseph, the same tokens that Joseph now will use to represent and rule as Pharaoh would. This is, again, the stories point at and kind of speak to each other in ways that contrast the behavior and the results for the two people involved. So, again, it served multiple purposes. It was an interlude, it built tension, and it also served this wonderful purpose of helping us contrast the individuals involved and their behavior and the results of their behavior. Let's talk about Egypt and famine. Again, this is an accurate historical portrayal of sort of Egypt's role in the world. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman world when Rome ruled over Egypt. It used Egypt as their primary food source. But in earlier times, people in Mesopotamia were dependent on rain. If the rains failed for any reason, their crops would not grow and famine would ensue. So there were constantly famines in the land of Canaan, where Joseph and Israel live. Egypt, however, is dependent on this river. And this river is fed from far south in Africa. And this river is where they get their water for their crops. And it never rains in Egypt. Almost never. And so the lack of rain does not impact Egypt in the same way it impacts the rest of the world. And Egypt often has food when other places don't. And so we have texts of people, Edomites, for example, going to Egypt and getting food there when there's famine in Canaan. So this idea of going to Egypt during famine is a well understood and known historical sort of trend. So what happens is in verse 42, or chapter 42, Joseph's 10 brothers, or Joseph's 11 brothers and father, are still living in Canaan, and the famine hits, just as Joseph predicted from Pharaoh's dream. And they run out of food. And they say, well, we're a fairly wealthy, herding people. We have some money. Let's go buy food in Egypt so we don't starve to death. And Jacob says, I'm going to send my 10 sons to go buy me food. I'm going to send you down to Egypt. But I'm going to leave one of my kids here because I just can't handle Benjamin leaving. Now, if we go back to that family tree, you remember Benjamin is Joseph's full brother? These other people are his half-brothers. And this is the son in his old age of his favored wife. He had taken the place of Joseph as the new favorite of his father. And he's young, and his father doesn't want him to go, and his father keeps him home. So these 10 brothers go down to Egypt to buy food. And lo and behold, it says, Jacob's 10 brethren went down to buy corn in Egypt. Corn is not really corn, right? It's grain. To buy grain in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren. For he said, lest peradventure mischief befall him. Verse 6, and Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the earth. Dream, right? But we're missing one of the brothers and the father, but this is the dream. Okay, Joseph saw his brothers and he knew them. But they, of course, did not know him. He's shaved, he's dressed like an Egyptian, he's sitting on the throne. They don't connect this person to the brother they had sold. So he knows them, they don't know him. They bow to him, just as they did in his dream, and ask for grain and buy grain from him. He accuses them of, let me get the right slide up here. When they meet Joseph accuses them of being spies. He says, you're spies and you've come to spy out the nakedness of the land. This is a sexual reference, and it's actually the term used to describe incest, right? to uncover your mother's nakedness. You're here to uncover the nakedness of the land. In other words, to spy out the things that should not be known. So he's accusing them of being spies from Edom and from up in Mesopotamia, come to spy on Egypt to see if Egypt can be conquered. And it seems like he uses the idea that there's 10 of them, right? Well, there's 10 of you. You don't need 10 people to buy grain. Why are there 10 people here? You're spies. You must be here to spy out the land so that the Edomites who were living in this famine can come and conquer our land and take our grain. Makes sense. In a famine, you might try to conquer the place that has grain. So he accuses them of being spies. And they swear up and down, we are not spies. In fact, the reason there's 10 of us is that we are the children children of our one man, and he had 12 children, and one of them is not Joseph. Actually, he is. He's right in front of them. They just don't know that. One of them is not, and the other is so young, and my father loves him, and we just couldn't handle bringing him. And he says, you're liars. He said, no, we're not. And so this is the beginning of the back and forth between Joseph and his brothers. That's a lot of fun. And when the first time I read this, I kind of was lost. Why is Joseph playing this game with his brothers? And it took a while for it to sink in. But Joseph doesn't trust his brothers. Of course not. His brothers sold him as a slave into Egypt. He thinks his brothers are still that sort of person, someone who would sell their brother as a slave in Egypt. He wants to know if they've changed. And so this story is the test that Joseph gives to his brothers to find out if they've changed. Joseph has one other goal. He wants to get his youngest brother here, because Benjamin was the one brother he got along with, his full brother. It's the other brother that his father loved, and it's the other brother who's his full brother. And this conflict between the brothers was a conflict between the children of different wives of their father. He wants his full brother here. He wants to protect his full brother from his other brothers, and he wants to see his dad if he can. And he doesn't trust his brothers to do any of these things, right? If he just said, "This is me, I'm Joseph, go bring Benjamin and bring my dad here," he doesn't know that they would do that. They sold him as a slave after all. But he wants to achieve his goal. He wants to get his younger brother here. He wants to get his dad here. He wants to test his brothers and see if there's still this sort of evil person who would do what they did to him. And so he begins this back and forth testing, where he says, "I think you're slaves," and he puts them in prison 3 days. So now his brothers get to taste a little of what he went through. They sent him as a slave, they put him in a pit, and Joseph sends them into the pit of the prison and for 3 days. And again, he's putting them through just a small taste of what he went through. And then he brings them up out of the prison, and he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm not just going to imprison you because I think you're spies. I'm going to give you a chance to prove you're not. Go home. Bring Benjamin back. And then I'll know you're telling the truth. And to make sure you do that, I'm going to keep one of you as in my prison. And he keeps Simeon. So he takes Simeon, arrests him in front of all the other brothers, binds him. So you can see this story. This looks very much like when Joseph was bound in front of all of his brothers and thrown. And he takes Simeon and he binds him in front of all of his brothers. And he puts him in the prison. And then he sends the brothers home. And before he does that, they start talking. Now, Joseph is using an interpreter. So they don't know that Joseph can speak Hebrew. So Joseph is speaking in Egyptian to his Hebrew brothers with an interpreter. But his brothers turn to each other and start speaking to each other in Hebrew, and Joseph is listening. And this is what they say. Verse 19. So if you're true men, so this is when he says, go and I'll keep one of you. 21. While they said to one another, "We are very guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." In other words, we saw Joseph in distress, and we didn't pay any attention, and so now we're being distressed. Now, they think this is happening to them because of what they did to Joseph. It is. And Reuben answered them, saying, "Spake I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child, and you would not hear me? Therefore, behold, this also his blood is required." Reuben wanted to save him, right? Reuben says, this is Reuben's "I told you so" moment. Right? And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spoke unto them by an interpreter. And then he turned himself about from them, and he wept. And he returned to them again, and communed with them, and he took from them Simeon, and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph commanded to fill their sacks with corn, and to restore every man his money into his sack, and to give them provision for the way, and thus he did unto them. Now what just happened there? He gave them the corn they wanted. They brought money to buy the corn. He gave them the corn and put the money back in the sack. Again, there's 2 reasons for this. He's not going to charge his father for food. He wants to send his food back to his father for free. But he also this is part of the test. Have my brothers changed? Are they the sort of person who will take the money and run and leave Simeon in prison? Or are they the sort of person who will come back, return the money and say, "You made a mistake." This is like you go to the grocery store and they give you too much change. Do you give it back? He's going to see, do they give the money back? Do they admit that this happened? Do they bring Benjamin? Do they leave Simeon in prison with me? What kind of people are they now? This is how this test is going to work. And you can imagine how they felt when they found the money in their sacks, right? Because now they might be they were already accused of being spies. Now they might be accused of being thieves. Now what do? And they're afraid. Let's see. I'm going to find the right verse for this. Let's look at verse 35 of chapter 42. And it came to pass as they emptied their sacks that behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they both and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said unto them, Me ye have bereaved of my children. Joseph is lost, and Simeon is not. And you will take Benjamin away, and these things are against me. And Reuben said unto his father, saying, Slay my 2 sons, if I bring him not to thee. Deliver him into my hand, and I will bring him to thee again. So what happens? Reuben says, we need to go back. And we need to bring Benjamin with us. And his dad's like, no. And he says, I promise you kill my sons if I don't bring him back. I promise I will bring him back. And he said, My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If mischief befall him by the way in which ye go, then shall ye bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. So they're afraid of several things now, of being accused of a thief, of not going back, of leaving Simeon there, and their dad won't let Benjamin go, etc. And so time passes. And eventually their dad is convinced to let Benjamin go. And the way he's convinced is they run out of food. They need more food or they're all going to die. And so his dad says, fine, take Benjamin. And at this point, verse 8, very importantly, Judah said unto Israel his father, Send the lad with me. And I'm in verse 8 of chapter 43. Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou, and also our little ones. And I will be surety for him. You know, a surety means like a loan. When you give out a loan, this is the collateral. I will be collateral for him. If I bring him not to thee and set him not before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. Now, again, Reuben and Judah come up. Reuben was the one who wanted to save Joseph, but ran out of time and found him gone when he came back to save him. Judah was the one who wanted to sell him. And in this case, both Reuben and Judah have said, no, we will take care of Benjamin if you send Benjamin with us. So they go back. This time with Benjamin in tow. And they bring double the money. They bring the money that was given to them. Last time, they're bringing back the change. And then they bring more money to buy more grain. And they bring gifts for Joseph to try to convince him, not to freak out and accuse them of theft. And so we're in chapter 43, verse 26. They show up, and Joseph comes in verse 26. Joseph came home, and they brought him to the present, which was in their hand, into the house, and they bowed themselves down to him to the earth. Now all his brothers are bowing to him. This is again the dream. And when Joseph, and 27, and he asked them of their welfare, and said, Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he yet alive? And they answered, Thy servant our father is in good health. He is yet alive. And they bowed down their heads and made obeisance. So he wants to know if his dad's okay. And it says in 29, they lifted up their eyes and he lifted up his eyes, and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And he said, Is this your younger brother of whom you spoken to me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, singular, his brother, singular. And he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber and wept there. So each time they come, he's now wept twice. So what happens? Well, he sends them off again. This time, again, with the money in the sacks. And this time he puts a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. So let's read this story. It says, he commanded his steward of his house, saying, Fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put every man's money in his sack, just like before. Verse 2 of chapter 44. And put my cup, my silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest, and his corn money. And he did according to the word which Joseph had spoken. Verse 4, when they had gone off out of the city and were not yet far off, Joseph said unto his steward, Up, follow after the men, and when thou dost overtake them, say unto them, Wherefore have ye rewarded evil for good? Is not this in which my Lord drinketh, and whereby indeed he divineth? To divine is to see visions. So apparently Joseph used this cup to see visions. It was a cup think of it like, I don't know if you've ever read or seen The Lord of the Rings. It's the Phial of Galadriel. This is a practiced, known divining technique. You take a cup, you fill it with water, and you look into it like a crystal ball, and you see visions. So this is his vision-seeing cup. And why have you done evil in so doing? So what happens? The servant stops them, says, someone has stolen my master's cup. And they're like, no. And then one of them says, whoever, go ahead and search. Whoever you find it with, let him die. We don't have the cup. Search and find whoever it is, you can die. So they search from the oldest to, you can imagine the tension building, from the oldest to the youngest, it says. So you can see how the author's building tension. And they go down the list. Is the cup here? No. But we're finding your money. You're stealing this money. And next step, money but not the cup. Money but not the cup. And they get to the youngest, and they open Benjamin's sack, and there's the cup. Now again, what is Joseph trying to do? If his brothers haven't changed, he really wants Benjamin with him. And see, now he has an excuse to take Benjamin because Benjamin stole his cup from his brothers where he can take care of Benjamin. But he also has given them a chance. If his brothers feel about Benjamin the way they felt about him, here's a perfect opportunity for them to leave Benjamin and go back to their dad and get rid of Benjamin just like they got rid of him. Except Benjamin won't actually be in prison. He'll be with his brother who loves him, and it'll all be okay. But at the same time, he can test his brothers. So he can test his brothers while taking care of Benjamin at the same time. So they bring him back, bring all the brothers back, and he says, again, they go through the whole thing. Why did you steal my cup? Did you think I couldn't divine? He says, he actually uses those terms. Do you think I can't use, my ability to see visions to know who stole my cup? I knew it was you. That's why I sent my servants after you. Why did you steal from me? Couldn't you figure out that someone like me has, magical powers? I can tell who stole my stuff. And the brothers, bow before him, and they beg him to let them go. And he says, take me. And he says, no, I'll let you all go. Just get out. Don't come back. But I'm keeping the one who stole the cup. I'm keeping Benjamin. Let me find the right place here. And then it says, this is where they said, so let's actually read it. Verse 16, Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God hath found out the iniquity of thy servants. Behold, we are thy Lord's servants, both we and also with whom the cup is found. And he said, God forbid that I should do so. He, Joseph, God forbid that I should do so. But the man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be my servant. And as for you, get you up in peace to your father. Get out, I'm keeping Benjamin. And Judah came near to him and said, and now we have like half a chapter where Judah just speaks. And again, most biblical speeches are very short. This is a long speech in kind of biblical terms. It goes on and on and on. But I'm just going to read a bit of it. Judah came and said, O my Lord, let my servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ear, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh. Skip to verse 30. Now behold, therefore, if I come unto thy servant my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound by the lad's life, it shall come to pass when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die, and thy servant shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant becomes surety for the lad unto my father, saying, if I bring him not to thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondsman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brother. Notice the word a bondsman. What just happened? Judah said, I will sell myself, your slave, to save Benjamin. Even if Benjamin's guilty, even if he stole this cup, I will be your slave in his place if you let him go back to my dad. Because my dad will be sad if he doesn't come home. That is not the same Judah who said, let's sell him so that we can make some money out of this. After all, we need to get rid of him. He's a tattletale. But let's just sell him so I can make some money while we're at it. He's changed. And Joseph has now seen that he's changed, right? That was the point of this test, among other things. And the fact that he didn't just say, let him go. He said, I will be your slave for the rest of my life in exchange for him. He's selling himself. And that is an adequate, for Joseph, response to what they did to him. They sold him as a slave, and now he says, I will be a slave if necessary to save Benjamin. So now it says, now we're in chapter 45. Joseph could not restrain himself before them, and he stood by him and he cried. And he said, cause every man to go out from me, while Joseph made himself known to his brethren. So now Joseph is going to tell them who he is, he says, and this is important. Be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God sent me before you to preserve your life. So Joseph says this was divine providence. I was sent here so that you would have food and you would not starve in this famine. I was sent by providence from God to save all of Egypt, to save you, to save my father's house. And he forgives his brothers. They forgive him. They embrace. And the dream, of course, came true. And his brothers bowed before him. So what does this story mean? What do I mean by myth? As I've said this before, a myth is a story, historical or not. It's not making any judgment there. But a myth is a story that has meaning or creates meaning for the community that hears it. This story has meaning. It has meaning with regard to the favoritism shown and how it creates problems. It has meaning with regard to the mistakes the people in it make, not just their goodness, but their mistakes. These are humans who make terrible, terrible mistakes, and yet they're forgiven, and they change, and they improve, and they repent. It also has meaning for the people who believed in God and God's providence. The God of the Bible doesn't operate in the way the myths of Zeus and Marduk did in the ancient Near East, that sort of thing. The God of the Bible works in human history, divine providence. Remember the man who told Joseph where to go? He shows up out of nowhere and says, your brothers are over there, go over there. That man, if he hadn't been there, Joseph never would have been sold into Egypt. The Exodus never would have happened. His father and brothers and himself probably would have died in the famine, right? So we see in the troubles people have, people who read this story saw in it the possibility of hope in the midst of troubles. If you're a slave in Egypt, maybe there's a purpose behind it. Maybe there's something good that will come out of it. And people react to that in a way that helps them bear trials. If they think there's maybe something that will come out of it, if there's something I can do here that will then save others, or that will, right? When we are in trial, if we feel there's a purpose to that trial, we will bear it better. And so this story tells the story of how someone suffered terrible, terrible things, was a slave, then was wrongly accused, then was put in prison, and all of these things worked together in the end to save himself, his family, etc. So divine providence is one of the core meanings of those who believed in this myth, which helped them through their own trials. The other meaning is one applied to it after by Christians. Christians reading this story many, many years later would see in it a type of Jesus Christ and the salvation that Jesus Christ brings. Again, the same sort of idea. Jesus suffered horrible things, and it brought about salvation. So I've got a list of these. I don't know if I have time to read them. I don't. I'm out of time. But you notice he was favored of his father, so was Jesus. He was rejected by his brothers, so was Jesus. He was sold by his brothers, so was Jesus. Judah is the one who sold him. Judas is the Greek name for Judah, and Judah sold Jesus to and Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Christ was sold for 30. Those are according to Exodus, the prices of slaves of the age that they each were at the time. In the attempt to destroy Joseph, his brothers set up the conditions for their salvation. In the attempt to kill Jesus, they set up the conditions for the atonement and salvation. Joseph began his mission preparing salvation for Israel at 30. So did Jesus. When Joseph was finally raised to the exalted position in Egypt, they all bowed to him, as did Jesus. And Joseph provided bread for Israel to save them without cost. And Jesus is the bread of life. So Christians reading this story would see Jesus prefigured in the life of Joseph. So, if you're a believer in the Christian tradition, you see in this God's foreshadowing of the life of Christ. If you're not a believer, you see in this mimeticism, which is where someone telling the story of Jesus weaves meaning from the earlier stories into it. In other words, Jesus' life mirrors Joseph's because the people who wrote Jesus' life story intentionally wrote it so that it would mirror that of Joseph. So whether you believe or you don't, the parallels are there, and they're very difficult to ignore. So they seem to be intentional in the story. I'm out of time. Next time, what are we going to do? Well, we need to finish the book of Genesis. So we're going to overview the entire book, talk about the themes of Genesis from the creation to the last moment, which we will tell and haven't got to yet, when Israel comes to Egypt, sees his son, and then blesses all of his children. That's how the book ends. So we'll finish Genesis, we'll overview all of that and its themes, and we'll set up and introduce the book of Exodus, which will tell this story of the Israelites in Egypt as slaves, as set up by the Joseph story, and that brings Moses to come to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, and that becomes the central story of Israelite life for generations to come. So we will overview Genesis, and we will set up the Exodus, and that's what we'll do next time, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.